Homeless boy decides to share his last meal with a stranger on the street. The next day, a limousine pulls up in front of him, and he has an unforgettable Christmas Eve. The streets of Boston were frigid, the kind of cold that sliced through layers of worn-out clothing like shards of glass. Jacob, a boy of no more than 14, huddled beneath an old, patched-up blanket on the steps of a closed diner. His hair was tangled, his face smeared with dirt, and his stomach churned with hunger that had become as familiar as the gray skies above. In his hands was a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, neatly wrapped in wax paper. It was the last thing he had to eat, a gift from a kind passerby earlier that day. Jacob knew he should save it for later, but the gnawing in his belly was insistent. As he unwrapped the sandwich, the sharp sound of boots on pavement caught his attention. A man, no older than his mid-30s, shuffled toward him. His clothes were tattered, his coat too thin for the weather, and his eyes, deeply lined and tired, were fixed on the ground. Jacob felt a pang of guilt. The man's expression reminded him of his mother's face before she passed. Worn, defeated, but somehow still kind. "Hey," Jacob called, his voice timid but clear. The man stopped, startled, and looked up. "You hungry?" The man hesitated, his sunken cheeks and hollow eyes betraying his pride. "I'm fine, kid. You keep it." Jacob shook his head and held out half of the sandwich. "I can't eat the whole thing anyway," he lied. "Come on, take it." For a moment, the man just stared, the air between them heavy with unspoken gratitude. Finally, he took the half sandwich with trembling hands and nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat together in silence, sharing what little they had. When the sandwich was gone, the man stood, still clutching the wax paper as if it were a treasure. He looked at Jacob, his voice breaking. "You're a good kid. Don't lose that, no matter what." Jacob nodded, offering a small smile, and the man shuffled away into the night. Jacob didn't think much of it afterward. It wasn't the first time he'd shared what little he had, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The next morning, Jacob was woken by the growl of an engine. Groggy, he rubbed his eyes and froze as a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb in front of him. The window rolled down, and the same man from the night before leaned out, looking vastly different. His hair was combed, his coat now thick and tailored, and his expression was resolute. "Get in," the man said, his voice firm but warm. Jacob hesitated. He had spent years learning to trust no one, yet something about the man's tone, and the memory of his tired eyes, made him stand. The driver opened the door, and Jacob climbed into the luxurious warmth of the car. "Where are we going?" Jacob asked, clutching his tattered blanket. The man smiled gently. "Somewhere you'll be safe. Somewhere warm." As the limousine pulled away, Jacob's heart raced. Suspicion, hope, and fear tangled within him as he looked out at the snowy streets. He didn't know what awaited him, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The limousine cruised silently through the snow-dusted streets of Boston, its interior cocooning Jacob in an almost otherworldly warmth. He sat stiffly on the plush leather seat, gripping his tattered blanket like a lifeline. The man from the night before sat across from him, studying Jacob with a soft but serious expression. "What's your name, kid?" the man finally asked. "Jacob," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nice to meet you, Jacob." "I'm Matthew," the man replied, offering a hand. Jacob hesitated before shaking it, noting the strength and warmth in Matthew's grip. As they crossed into a quieter part of the city, the towering buildings gave way to modest suburban homes. The streets felt calmer here, almost serene compared to the chaos Jacob was used to. He couldn't stop himself from asking, "Why are you helping me?" Matthew leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said after a moment. "And sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change someone's life." Jacob didn't reply, unsure of what to say. His instincts warned him to be cautious, but Matthew's words stirred something within him. A fragile hope he thought had died long ago. The limousine came to a stop in front of a small, neatly kept home with a pale blue door. A soft glow poured from the windows, casting a welcoming light onto the snow-covered driveway. Matthew opened his door and motioned for Jacob to follow. As they approached the house, the door swung open, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 30s, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her eyes warm and kind. "Matthew," she greeted, her voice tinged with relief. "You're back." "This is Jacob," Matthew said, gently guiding the boy forward. "He'll be staying with us for a while." Jacob froze, unsure of what to do. The woman crouched to his level, her smile genuine. "Hi, Jacob. I'm Claire. You must be freezing. Let's get you inside and warm you up." The warmth of the house was almost overwhelming. The faint smell of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, and the soft hum of a heater created a comforting backdrop. Jacob's eyes darted around the cozy living room, taking in the decorated Christmas tree, the neatly arranged bookshelves, and the crackling fireplace. Claire handed him a mug of steaming hot cocoa. "Drink up. It'll help," she said. He wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. It had been so long since anyone had cared for him like this, and he didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," he mumbled. Matthew and Claire exchanged a look, one that Jacob couldn't quite decipher. Then Matthew spoke. "Jacob, I don't know your whole story, but I can guess it hasn't been easy. You don't have to tell us anything you're not ready to. But Claire and I want you to know that you're safe here. No strings attached." The sincerity in Matthew's voice disarmed Jacob. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe just a little that he might have found a place where he belonged. That night, Jacob slept in a real bed. The sheets were soft, the blankets heavy, and the pillow cradled his head like a cloud. As he drifted off, a single thought echoed in his mind. This can't be real. But when he woke the next morning to the smell of breakfast and the sound of laughter, he realized it was. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The smell of bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the house as Jacob stirred from the deepest sleep he'd had in years. At first, he panicked. This wasn't the cold, hard street corner he was used to. Then the events of the previous day rushed back. The limousine, Matthew, and the warm bed were all real. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his tangled hair, and glanced around the small but cozy room. A soft knock on the door startled him. "Jacob," Claire's voice was gentle. "Breakfast is ready. Come down whenever you're comfortable." For a moment, Jacob hesitated. Years of being on his own had taught him to be wary of people who seemed too good to be true. But something about Matthew and Claire felt different. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the room. The dining room was bright and welcoming, the morning sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Matthew sat at the head of the table, reading a newspaper, while Claire hummed a soft tune as she poured juice into glasses. A plate piled high with scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon sat at the center of the table. "Morning, champ," Matthew greeted, setting down the paper. "Grab a seat. Claire makes the best scrambled eggs in Boston." Claire laughed. "That's a bit of an exaggeration. But thank you, Matthew." Jacob sat cautiously, his eyes darting between the two. He didn't know when he last had a proper breakfast, or any meal he didn't scrounge up himself. He reached for a piece of toast but paused, glancing at Claire for approval. "Help yourself," she said warmly. As they ate, Claire and Matthew asked him casual questions, his favorite foods, if he liked movies, how he spent his time. They didn't press him about his past, and Jacob was grateful for that. By the time breakfast was over, he felt a little more at ease. Claire began clearing the table. "Jacob, there's a shower upstairs, and I left some clean clothes on the counter for you. I hope they fit." "Thanks," Jacob said quietly, unsure how else to respond to such kindness. As he climbed the stairs to the bathroom, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at him. What did they want from him? Why were they being so kind? His reflection in the mirror caught his eye. A thin, scruffy boy stared back at him, his eyes filled with suspicion and guarded hope. Later, Jacob found himself sitting with Matthew in the living room. The fire crackled warmly, and a chessboard sat between them. "Ever play?" Matthew asked, gesturing to the board. Jacob shook his head. No, I don't know how. Matthew grinned. Perfect. I'll teach you. As Matthew explained the rules, his tone was patient, and his movements unhurried. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Jacob felt like someone saw him, not as a burden, but as a person worth knowing. That evening, after dinner, Jacob sat alone by the fireplace. Claire brought him a blanket and a cup of chamomile tea. Take your time, Jacob, she said softly before leaving him to his thoughts. Staring into the flames, Jacob's walls began to crack. The memories he had worked so hard to suppress came flooding back. His mother's laughter turning to coughs, her hands slipping from his as she grew weaker, and the cold loneliness that followed her death. Jacob tightened the blanket around himself and wiped his eyes roughly. He wasn't ready to trust completely, but something about this house, about Matthew and Claire, felt safe. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to whisper a wish into the stillness of the room. Please, let this last. The days passed with a comforting rhythm in Matthew and Claire's home. Jacob gradually eased into this new life, though he still carried the weight of his past like a heavy backpack he couldn't set down. The kindness in the house was unrelenting, and yet, in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered warnings. Don't get used to it. Nothing good lasts. One evening, after dinner, Matthew found Jacob sitting on the porch steps, gazing at the stars. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and a silence hung between them that Matthew decided to break. You've been quiet, he said, sitting down beside him. Jacob shrugged, pulling the blanket Claire had given him tighter around his shoulders. I'm just not used to all this, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It's weird, Matthew chuckled softly. Weird good or weird bad? Both, I guess, Jacob muttered, glancing sideways at him. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Matthew leaned back, letting the cool air brush against his face. When I was your age, someone helped me, he said, his voice calm and reflective. I was in a rough spot too, but this man, he didn't ask me why or how I ended up there. He just helped, and it changed my life. Jacob looked at him, his skepticism softened by curiosity. What did you do after that? Matthew smiled, his eyes distant as if recalling a memory. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd pay it forward. Jacob didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long expecting the worst that accepting genuine kindness felt foreign. He stared at the stars, the faint warmth of Matthew's words settling somewhere deep within him. The following morning, Claire suggested they visit a local thrift store. You need some warmer clothes, Jacob, she said, her tone light but insistent. Boston winters don't play around. Jacob hesitated, but Claire wouldn't take no for an answer. She led him through rows of sweaters, jackets, and scarves, always deferring to his preferences. When they returned home with bags of clothing, Jacob was overwhelmed. Not by the items, but by the effort she had put into making him feel cared for. That afternoon, while sorting through the clothes in his room, Jacob came across a small journal tucked into one of the pockets of a second-hand jacket. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed, and it had the faint scent of old paper. Intrigued, he flipped it open to find it blank. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Jacob sat by the fireplace and picked up the journal again. He stared at the empty page, unsure why it felt so significant. Then, as if compelled, he began to write. Not much, just a few words. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but for the first time in a long time, I feel safe. He set the journal aside and stared into the flames. For once, the voice in his head that told him to run, to doubt, was quiet. Over the next few weeks, Jacob became more comfortable in the house. He helped Claire in the kitchen, learning how to chop vegetables and bake cookies. He played chess with Matthew, finally winning a match after countless tries. And on one snowy afternoon, he even ventured into the backyard to build a lopsided snowman, laughing when Claire placed a carrot upside down for the nose. But it wasn't just the routines that changed Jacob. It was the way Matthew and Claire treated him. They didn't press him for answers about his past, didn't demand gratitude or obedience. They simply showed up every day with patience, understanding, and a quiet persistence that chipped away at his defenses. Still, Jacob couldn't fully shake the feeling that this life was temporary, that something would come along to snatch it away. And so, even as the days grew brighter, a shadow lingered in his heart. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, Matthew brought up Christmas. "It's only a week away," he said. "I was thinking we could go pick out a tree tomorrow." Jacob froze. He hadn't celebrated Christmas since his mother passed. The thought of it now felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with his fork. "Come on, Jacob," Claire encouraged. "It'll be fun. We'll get cocoa afterward, and you can pick the ornaments." Matthew leaned forward with a grin. "And if you don't like cocoa, Claire makes a mean cider." Jacob couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do it." The next day, they bundled up and drove to a tree farm on the outskirts of the city. Jacob's breath formed small clouds in the frosty air as he wandered among the rows of evergreens. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement, pure, unguarded joy. "This one," he finally said, pointing to a sturdy, full tree with bright green needles. "It's perfect," Matthew laughed. "Good choice, kid." As they loaded the tree onto the car and headed home, Jacob stared out the window, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that good things could last. But fate, as always, had its own plans. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the living room, its branches adorned with strings of lights, mismatched ornaments, and a star that tilted slightly to one side. Jacob found himself drawn to it, often sitting nearby, mesmerized by the twinkling lights. For the first time in years, the season felt magical, not like the hollow ache it had been since his mother's passing. Matthew and Claire kept busy preparing for Christmas, their warmth infectious. Yet, as the days passed, Jacob's unease began to grow. It wasn't any one thing but a feeling, like an approaching storm. On Christmas Eve morning, Jacob awoke to the sound of voices downstairs. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was tense. Slipping out of bed, he crept down the stairs and found Matthew in the doorway, speaking with a man dressed in a heavy coat and scarf. The man's face was partially obscured, but there was no mistaking his rigid posture. Jacob lingered out of sight, his heart pounding. "Who is he?" he wondered. "You have no right." Matthew's voice was firm but controlled. "I have every right," the man interrupted, his tone sharp. "I'm his father." Jacob's blood ran cold. His father, a man he hadn't seen or heard from since he was 6 years old. The memories of shouting matches, slammed doors, and the night his father walked out flooded back with such force that Jacob had to grip the banister to steady himself. Claire appeared in the hallway, her hand on Matthew's arm. "Let's talk inside," she said softly, glancing toward the stairs as if she sensed Jacob nearby. Reluctantly, Matthew stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. Jacob darted back up the stairs, his heart racing. He shut the door to his room and pressed his back against it, struggling to breathe. Why was his father here? What did he want? Minutes passed. Agonizing, slow minutes, before there was a knock on his door. "Jacob," Claire's voice was gentle. "Can I come in?" He hesitated, then opened the door. Her expression was kind but serious. "Your father's here," she said softly. "He wants to talk to you." "No," Jacob said immediately, his voice trembling. "I don't want to see him." Claire knelt in front of him, her eyes searching his. "I understand," she said, "but he says he's looking for a chance to make things right." Jacob shook his head, anger and fear bubbling up inside him. He had years to make things right. He doesn't care. He never cared. Claire reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to talk to him if you don't want to," she assured him. "This is your choice." Jacob stayed in his room for hours, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of the life he had built with Matthew and Claire, the warmth they had given him. But a small, stubborn part of him, the part that remembered his father's rare smiles and kind words, wondered if maybe, just maybe, people could change. Finally, as the sky darkened, he opened his door. Claire was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, And when she saw him, she nodded encouragingly. Jacob stepped into the living room, his heart pounding. His father stood by the window, staring out into the snowy night. When he turned to face Jacob, his expression was a mix of guilt and hope. "Hi, Jacob," he said, his voice softer than Jacob remembered. "You've grown so much." Jacob crossed his arms, keeping his distance. "Why are you here?" The man exhaled, his shoulders slumping. I made a lot of mistakes," he began. "Leaving you and your mom was the worst one. I've spent years trying to fix myself, to be better. And when I heard you were out here on your own, I had to come." Jacob stared at him, his emotions swirling. "You left us," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom needed you, and you just left." "I know," his father said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'll never be able to make up for that. But I'm here now, and I want to help. If you'll let me." The room fell silent, the tension almost unbearable. Jacob didn't know what to say. He wanted to scream, to cry, to believe his father's words and reject them all at once. "I don't know if I can trust you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father nodded. "That's fair," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere this time. You can take all the time you need." That night, Jacob sat by the Christmas tree, his journal open in his lap. He stared at the blank page, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, second chances could be real. The tree lights twinkled, casting soft shadows across the room. As the clock struck midnight, the weight in Jacob's chest began to lift, if only slightly. For now it was enough. Christmas morning dawned quietly. Snow blanketed the streets outside, muffling the world in a serene white stillness. Jacob sat by the window in his room, watching the flakes drift lazily from the sky. His father's arrival the night before had left him restless. Sleep had been elusive, his thoughts a tangled web of anger, confusion, and a cautious, fragile hope. Downstairs, the smell of fresh-baked cinnamon rolls wafted through the house. Claire's laughter mingled with Matthew's deeper chuckle, a soft reminder of the warmth that surrounded Jacob. For a brief moment, he considered staying in his room, avoiding the world altogether. But the sound of voices, one of them his father's, drew him out. When Jacob entered the living room, Matthew was setting a stack of plates on the dining table, while Claire poured hot coffee into mugs. His father stood awkwardly by the Christmas tree, his hands in his coat pockets. The sight of him made Jacob's stomach twist, but he kept walking. "Good morning," Matthew said, his smile as easy as ever. "You hungry?" Claire made enough cinnamon rolls to feed the whole neighborhood. Jacob nodded, muttering a quiet, "Morning." The meal was quiet at first. Matthew and Claire kept the conversation light, chatting about the snowfall and their plans for the day. Jacob kept his head down, eating in silence. His father occasionally glanced at him, but he didn't push for conversation. Finally, after the plates were cleared, Jacob stood. "Can we talk?" he asked, looking directly at his father. The man straightened, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. They moved to the porch, where the cold air nipped at their faces. Jacob shoved his hands into his pockets, staring out at the snow-covered street. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "Why now?" Jacob finally asked, his voice tight. "Why show up after all this time?" His father exhaled, his breath forming a small cloud in the icy air. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "I knew I'd messed up, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought staying away was better for you and your mom." Jacob turned to face him, his eyes blazing. "It wasn't. She needed you and I needed you, and you just left." "I know," his father said, his voice breaking. "I know I failed you. I've lived with that every day since. And I'm not asking you to forgive me, Jacob. I just want a chance to be here now, to try and make things right." The raw honesty in his father's voice caught Jacob off guard. He wanted to lash out, to cling to his anger, but the vulnerability in front of him made it hard. He looked away, his breath hitching. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Jacob said, his voice cracking. I guess you can try. His father nodded, his eyes glistening. That's all I ask. When they returned inside, the warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Matthew and Claire were in the kitchen, packing leftover cinnamon rolls into a tin. They glanced up as Jacob and his father entered, and Claire offered Jacob a soft smile, as if to say, "You're doing great." The rest of the day passed in a quiet, peaceful blur. They decorated gingerbread cookies and played board games by the fire. For the first time in years, Jacob felt the weight of Christmas not as a reminder of loss, but as a day filled with connection and possibility. That evening, as the snow fell steadily outside, Jacob sat by the tree, his journal in hand. He flipped to a new page and began to write. Today I gave him a chance. I don't know what comes next, but maybe that's okay. For the first time, the thought of an uncertain future didn't terrify him. Instead, it felt like a door, a small, hesitant opening to something new. The days following Christmas were a cautious dance between past wounds and tentative beginnings. Jacob's father, James, didn't push too hard, respecting the unspoken boundaries that still hung between them. He stayed at a nearby motel, returning each day to spend time with Jacob, Matthew, and Claire. At first, Jacob avoided being alone with him. He preferred the comfortable, steady presence of Matthew or Claire nearby. But as the days passed, he began to notice small things about James. The way he carefully listened when Jacob spoke. His nervous habits of tapping his fingers against his thigh or tugging at his coat when he wasn't sure of himself. One afternoon, while Matthew was out running errands and Claire worked in the kitchen, James found Jacob in the backyard. The snowman they had built days ago was now slumping, its carrot nose dangling precariously. "Mind if I sit?" James asked, motioning to the patio bench where Jacob was perched. Jacob shrugged but didn't say no. James took the invitation, sitting quietly for a moment before speaking. "You know, when you were little, you loved building snowmen," James said, a faint smile crossing his face. "We'd spend hours outside, and your mom would have to drag us in before we froze." Jacob didn't look at him, his eyes focused on the snow-covered yard. "I don't remember that," he said flatly. James nodded, his expression tinged with regret. "I don't blame you. It was a long time ago." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, Jacob felt like James wasn't trying to force something. He was just there. Later that evening, after dinner, Jacob lingered in the living room while Matthew and Claire cleaned up in the kitchen. James sat on the couch, leafing through a photo album Claire had brought out earlier. "This was you, right?" James asked, holding up a picture of a small boy with a mischievous grin, bundled in an oversized scarf. Jacob couldn't help but smile faintly. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "Mom loved that scarf. She made me wear it even when it wasn't cold." James chuckled, the sound light but genuine. "She always knew best, didn't she?" Jacob nodded, his smile fading as he looked at the picture. "She really missed you, you know," he said quietly. "Even when she tried to hide it, I could tell." James set the album down, his face serious. "I missed her too, Jacob, and I missed you. I didn't know how to come back." As the days turned into weeks, the tension between them began to ease. James started to show up with small gestures. A book he thought Jacob might like, hot chocolate from the cafe down the street. They weren't grand gestures, but they were enough to show that he was trying. One snowy afternoon, James showed up with a sled. "There's a hill just a few blocks away," he said, his tone almost shy. "What do you say?" Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The hill was alive with the sound of children laughing, their colorful scarves and jackets bright against the white snow. Jacob and James took turns on the sled, tumbling into the powdery drifts more times than they could count. For the first time in years, Jacob laughed. A real, unguarded laugh that echoed through the crisp winter air. As they trudged home, cheeks red from the cold, James glanced at Jacob. "Thanks for today," he said. "It meant a lot to me." Jacob didn't reply, but the small smile on his face said enough. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, he picked up his journal. "I think he's trying. And maybe I'm starting to believe him. Jacob closed the journal and stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through his window. For the first time, he felt like the pieces of his life, broken and scattered for so long, might slowly be finding their way back together. The weeks after Christmas passed like a soft snowfall, slow and quiet, yet steady. Jacob began to find a tentative rhythm with James. They spoke more often, though always on neutral ground. Memories of snowmen, books Jacob was reading, or the strange habits of the neighbor's cat that liked to wander into the yard. But the past still lingered, a shadow neither of them could quite face directly. Claire noticed the progress and encouraged it gently. Healing isn't a straight path, she told Jacob one evening as they washed dishes together. It's okay to feel unsure. Just take it one step at a time. One day, as Jacob rummaged through a box of Matthew's old tools in the garage, James appeared in the doorway. "Need help?" he asked, his voice light but cautious. Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess." They worked in silence for a while, Jacob untangling wires while James sorted screws into small compartments. It wasn't until they were almost finished that James spoke again. "Your mom. She used to fix everything around the house," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't much good with tools, but she could repair just about anything." Jacob glanced at him. "I remember that," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She fixed my bike when I bent the wheel." James chuckled softly. She wasn't just fixing things. She was holding everything together. The weight of his words settled between them. Jacob wanted to say something, to ask the questions that had burned in his chest for years. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded and went back to the wires. A week later, while Matthew and Claire were out for the evening, James arrived with a small box under his arm. "Thought we could watch something," he said, holding up an old DVD of the Goonies. Jacob's eyes lit up. "I used to love that movie," he said before he could stop himself. "I know," James said with a small smile. "You made me watch it 100 times." They settled onto the couch, a bowl of popcorn between them. As the movie played, Jacob found himself laughing, not just at the jokes but at James's commentary. His dry remarks about the pirate ship and his exaggerated impressions of the characters. For a little while, it felt almost normal. But healing wasn't a straight path, as Claire had said. The closer James and Jacob grew, the more the old pain rose to the surface. One evening, after James left, Jacob retreated to his room and opened his journal. The words poured out before he could stop them. "He left us. He left her. I don't know if I can ever forgive him for that." When Jacob looked at the page, the anger he felt was undeniable. But beneath it was something else. A small, fragile hope that maybe, one day, forgiveness would come. One icy morning, Matthew and Claire suggested a hike through a nearby trail, one that ended at a frozen lake. Jacob agreed reluctantly, bundling up in layers of sweaters and scarves. To his surprise, James showed up, ready to join them. The hike was challenging, the ground slippery and uneven, but the lake was worth it. It stretched out like a silver mirror, the trees reflected perfectly on its surface. Jacob stood at the edge, his breath visible in the cold air. "This is amazing," he said, turning to James. "Mom would have loved this." James nodded, his expression soft. "She would have," he said. "She always found beauty in everything." For the first time, Jacob didn't feel the need to pull away. He let the moment linger, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises. That night, as Jacob wrote in his journal, he paused before setting his pen to paper. Slowly, he wrote, "I don't know if I can forgive him yet, but I think I want to try." The words felt heavy and light all at once, like the first step across a fragile bridge. A week after the hike, Jacob's cautious peace was shattered by an unexpected visit. James had stayed consistent in his efforts, showing up each day with quiet patience. But this time, someone else arrived alongside him. A woman Jacob didn't recognize. She had sharp features, her coat immaculate, and an expression that made the room feel smaller. "This is Karen," James said, his tone careful. She's my partner." Jacob stiffened immediately. "You brought her here?" The question came out sharper than he intended. "I thought it was time you met," James replied, his voice faltering under the weight of Jacob's glare. Karen stepped forward, her hand extended. "It's nice to finally meet you, Jacob." But Jacob didn't move. Instead, he turned and walked out the back door, the sound of it slamming echoing behind him. Matthew found him sitting on the porch steps, his breath coming in angry clouds. "Hey, kid," he said gently, taking a seat beside him. Jacob didn't look at him. "He just shows up with her like that, like it's no big deal. He doesn't get it." "No," Matthew agreed. "He doesn't. But maybe he's trying to." Jacob clenched his fists. "I was starting to trust him. Now it's like he's replacing everything. Mom, me, all of it." Matthew let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. "Do you think that's what he wants?" Jacob hesitated, his anger flickering with doubt. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it feels that way." Matthew put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've been through more than most people ever should. But trust isn't about pretending things are perfect. It's about figuring out if you want to build something, even when it's messy." That night, Jacob sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. When James approached, he didn't look up. "I'm sorry," James said quietly, sitting across from him. "I should have asked before bringing Karen. That wasn't fair to you." Jacob didn't respond right away. He felt the knot of anger in his chest loosening, but it wasn't gone. "Why did you leave us?" he asked suddenly, his voice trembling. "I've been trying to figure it out, but I don't get it. Why didn't you stay?" James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression heavy with regret. "I was scared," he said. "Your mom was strong, so much stronger than I ever was. I felt like I wasn't good enough for her or for you. So instead of fighting to be better, I ran." Jacob's throat tightened. "She didn't deserve that. I didn't deserve that." "No," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The weight of James's words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Jacob didn't know if he could forgive him. Not yet. But something in his father's voice made him want to try. As the days passed, James stayed consistent, careful not to push too hard. Karen didn't return, and Jacob noticed James giving him more space, letting him dictate the pace of their growing relationship. For the first time, Jacob felt like he had some control, like his feelings mattered. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room playing chess, Jacob spoke without looking up. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet." James nodded, his expression somber. "That's okay. I'm not going anywhere." The simplicity of the statement caught Jacob off guard. He glanced at his father, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. "I guess we can keep trying," Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. James smiled faintly. "I'd like that." That evening, Jacob wrote in his journal again. "I think I'm ready to see what happens next. Maybe it won't be perfect, but maybe that's okay." For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like something worth exploring. The winter began to thaw, the heavy snows giving way to soft, muddy ground and the first signs of green poking through the frost. Jacob found himself spending more time outside, his energy lighter, his steps less burdened. James continued to visit, always careful not to overstay or overwhelm. He brought small, thoughtful gestures. A thermos of soup on a cold day, a new journal when Jacob's old one began to fill up. They talked more often, though not always about the past. Sometimes it was about books or the stars or even nothing at all. One quiet evening, as Jacob helped Claire clean up after dinner, she paused, leaning against the counter with a knowing smile. "You're doing well, Jacob," she said. "I can see it in you." He shrugged, rinsing a plate. "I guess it's different. That's what growth feels like," she said. "Messy, uncomfortable, but worth it." Jacob nodded. "I'm still mad sometimes. At him. At everything." "That's okay," Claire replied. "Healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about learning to carry it differently." The next weekend, James invited Jacob to visit a community center where he volunteered. "They've got a great library," he said. "Thought you might like it." Jacob agreed, more out of curiosity than excitement. When they arrived, He was surprised to see James greeted warmly by the staff and kids. He watched as his father worked with a group of younger boys, helping them build model planes. The ease and kindness in James's actions caught Jacob off guard. "Is this what you've been doing?" Jacob asked later, as they sat on the steps outside the center. James nodded. "It's part of what helped me get my life back together, being around people who needed someone to show up for them. It reminded me of what I'd lost and what I still had to give." Jacob was quiet, turning the words over in his mind. For the first time, he saw James not just as the man who had left, but as someone truly trying to be better. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings. The neighborhood buzzed with life. Kids on bikes, dogs barking, flowers blooming in front yards. Matthew and Claire encouraged Jacob to make plans for the summer, suggesting activities he might enjoy. For the first time, he considered the possibility of a future, one with stability, with joy. On a warm Saturday, James invited Jacob to plant a tree in the backyard. "Something to grow alongside us," James said with a small smile. Jacob smirked. "That's cheesy." "Maybe," James replied, "but it's worth a shot." They worked together, digging into the soft earth, their hands dirty and their laughter easy. When the tree was finally planted, they stood side by side, looking at the small sapling swaying gently in the breeze. "It's a start," Jacob said quietly. James glanced at him, his expression soft. "It is." That night, Jacob sat at his desk, staring at his journal. He flipped through the filled pages, the entries a record of his journey. Anger, doubt, tentative hope. He reached the last page and wrote carefully, "I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time I think I'm okay with that. We're growing, all of us, and maybe that's enough." Closing the journal, Jacob set it aside and climbed into bed. As he drifted off to sleep, the weight on his chest felt lighter, replaced by the steady rhythm of possibility. Jacob's story wasn't one of perfect endings or sweeping resolutions, but it was real, a story of growth, of small steps and hard conversations, of learning to let go and hold on at the same time. And in the quiet, messy beauty of it all, Jacob discovered something he thought he'd lost forever: the courage to believe in tomorrow.